Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's been quite a while, but I've seen some things on YouTube that I guess gave me a kick up the arse to make a new video. So yeah, today I wanted to talk about Lars Ulrich. I watched a video by a channel called, I think it's just called Heavy. But I don't think it's really a metal channel out and out. You know, it sounds like one of these like AI narrated sort of things. I don't know who runs it. I think it's been around quite a while though, but I do think they do kind of somewhat generic rock and metal coverage. But yeah, the narrator always sounds like it could be a human narrating it, and they're just incredibly, I don't know, soulless. But it kind of sounds like it's at best somebody's written up a script and it's read out by an AI voice. But yeah, in any case, they posted a couple of videos. Some of them are old, some of them I think are slightly newer, but they have this sort of running series, the victims of. If any of you know me at all, you'll know that I'm really not a fan of like sort of victim culture and cancel culture and any of those sorts of ways of looking at life. So anyway, I guess I got triggered. So I ended up clicking the videos just to see what they were about. There were two. There was a Van Halen one, which was like the victims of Eddie Van Halen, and it talked about Sammy Hagar and Michael Anthony, and in particular Michael Anthony and the sort of removal of his equal shares in Van Halen, and Alex and Eddie taking, I guess, more ownership of the IPs, in terms of the actual music and royalties and that sort of thing. Yeah, I have my opinions on that. It's not really the main topic of this video. Yeah, maybe I'll circle back to that later. Anyway, the main topic of this video is to do with Lars Ulrich, and actually really his relationship with James Hetfield, and who's to blame for what, because the second video that I watched in this sort of series was the victims of Lars Ulrich, and in the thumbnail it had Dave Mustaine and Jason Newsted. So the video sort of goes out to point out that as early as the beginning of Metallica, the band was having problems with Lars, which I find really interesting. So this comes from some statements that Ron McGovney made, and he's talking about how, even when he showed up and started in the band, Lars wasn't a very good drummer, and he, quote, couldn't find the one. Now, I'm not quoting Ron McGovney directly, I'm quoting the video that they say is a quote. Pretty sure that's correct. I'll link the video in the description. I'll track it down, link it in the description, you can have a look at it. In any case, I think the sort of general insinuation that Lars is completely piss poor as a drummer is flawed at best. And yeah, perhaps when they were starting out as like a garage band, maybe he really just didn't know anything. I think that's understandable. Sometimes enthusiasm will take you a long way when you don't have skills. What do they say? Fake it to make it? I think maybe Lars is definitely a case of someone who is going to fake it to make it for the first while. I think that's why he sort of ended up hanging out with Diamond Head and those guys to learn the craft, And whatever he did, it must have worked, because back in '82, when they would have been recording Kill 'Em All, that's analog only recording, right? There's nowhere to hide. That band had no budget either. So, you go in and you've got maybe a couple of weeks at most to record. You're probably going to spend one of those days just getting things set up and getting the sound right, and barely getting anything tracked. And if you make a mistake or you've got punched something in, it's got consequences because you're going to have to cut and glue tape to make that work. And that's time consuming. And it's very skilled labor and all those consequences. So if you listen to Kill 'Em All, and I think everyone acknowledges that Kill 'Em All's a decent record. And no one really complains about Lars's drumming on Kill 'Em All. Yeah, it's not as advanced as it is on Master of Puppets. But you wouldn't expect it to be, right? But it's decent. It's a good record. It stands on its own. And had it not been for more recent events in Metallica's history, no one would really be questioning Lars' skill based off of Kill 'Em All. So yeah, when I hear the Ron McGovney thing, I take it with a pinch of salt because it's sort of like, that's just your opinion, man, at the time, you know? And yeah, maybe there's just a bit of bitterness there. And yeah, Ron McGovney probably was a better bass player than Lars was a drummer at the time. I can totally see that. But yeah, I find it difficult to believe though that Hetfield would split with Ulrich that early on, just because it was them clubbing together, creating the band that formed the genesis of the band. You know, it's sort of like if you ally yourself with someone like that, you don't walk away that easy. But then again, maybe the band's young enough that the relationship, isn't that deep or strong yet. So yeah, maybe there's some credibility to that. I don't know. But the next thing that this video goes on to tackle is the Dave Mustaine firing. And again, so now we get to just before the sessions really for Kill 'Em All, don't we? And they're going to New York to record, and yeah, literally, just before the sessions are going to start, they wake him up in the morning and like hand him a bus ticket, don't they? And send him home. And yeah, it sounds really, really, really harsh. I think very few bands these days would ever consider firing a member like that. But it was a different time for a start. Sending someone halfway across the country with a bus ticket, at least you paid for the bus ticket. There was a sort of courtesy in that, I suppose. But I think you have to put yourself in Lars and James's shoes, right? They try to pin this very much on Lars, but I don't think that's fair. Lars and James have been very much a partnership this whole time. Lars, I think, represents probably the sort of drive, or at least in those days, represented the sort of the business acumen, if you will, and the drive and determination of the band. So like he'd be on the phone making calls, booking things, that kind of stuff. Spreading the word, tape trading, all that kind of stuff. Working the connections, if you will, and then also being the drummer, right? Whereas I think Hetfield is the backbone of the writing. I think Lars would be the very first person to acknowledge that if he didn't have Hetfield, he wouldn't have all those great riffs, but it goes beyond riffs, but he wouldn't have the riff machine, and that would be it. He always used to say fuck everybody, I've got Hetfield in tow, and that's it, we're going to kick ass. So I think that shows his trust in Hetfield as somebody, who's going to write the bulk of the material. I think where Lars' strength comes in when it comes to writing is in arrangement. How often do we repeat this part? Now, don't get me wrong, I know, don't spit bullets in the comments. He gets carried away and over arranges things and stuff like that. He's made stylistic choices for the band that have been the wrong course, for sure. But I don't think he's really acted alone. But I'll get to that again in a second. Back to the Dave Mustaine thing, though. The video really goes out to claim about, the long-term damage to Dave Mustaine, and there's some kind of monster footage where he's talking about people walking down the street and shouting Metallica at him to taunt him and stuff. And look, in your own words, Dave, you've got no time for feeling sorry. Right, no time for feeling sorry. So, you know, at the end of the day, Dave's a big boy, he can take care of himself. And he's got a really awesome band, you know, like they're really awesome and they've held their credibility for, you know, they've only had like one little minor blip, which was Risk, but otherwise, you know, they've held really high credibility in the metal genre for the longest time. So yeah, I don't feel too sorry for Dave Mustaine, but I do think that, at least from the perspective of crediting Dave's contributions, which I don't think are as numerous as people make out. It's like, some people want to make out that Dave wrote Kill 'Em All and wrote Ride the Lightning, and I just don't think that's accurate. I think what you're probably looking at is probably one of the points in the band's history where they were most collaborative. So they had James coming up with riffs, they had Dave coming up with riff and probably some arrangement ideas, because some of it sounds like the kind of stuff that he might arrange. You know, how like one riff might connect to another riff, or whether it would be a tail and how the tail would go. Certainly with the solo sections and things like that from Kill 'Em All, I think it's really evident, because Kirk came in and kind of tried to honor what was there mostly, to a large degree, at least in terms of the feel and the vibe. It's only from Ride the Lightning really where he's playing much more with his own voice. So yeah, I think in some ways Dave's contribution is blown out of proportion, but I also think in some ways it's understated. But at the end of the day, I think they should have been really clear and transparent and credited him, you know, with what he was due, which is probably more than they let on for a while. So in that sense, yeah, okay. But was it just Lars? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think Hetfield's the kind of guy to just let Lars walk all over him and like be Lars's little bitch. Like, can you imagine that, like, Hetfield, this big guy, getting like bullied by this little Danish guy? It doesn't really sound very plausible. Anyway, so that was the Dave Mustaine thing. Then they went on to the Jason Newsted thing. And of course, we're talking about And Justice for All. And Flemming Rasmussen was the sort of reference. And they were talking about the decision to mix down the bass. And it being a case that they all came back in the studio and Lars had turned down the bass. And again, every other source I've read, even by their own admission, it's always been the two of them, the pair of them, that acted together in that. That's what I'd always heard. And there's a way in which I think it makes more sense that Hetfield probably had a lot to do with turning it down. I know they like to blame the grieving over Cliff for why they hazed Jason so badly and why they turned him down. And Flemming Rasmussen's idea is that because Jason wouldn't stand up for himself, they turned the bass down to like press him that final time to see like would he speak up? Would he be like, no, fuck that, turn the bass back up? And he didn't, and it was like this big disappointment to them. Okay, that's fine, I can buy some of that, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's not a prank when it gets pressed and gets released out into the world. They must have known how it sounded. You know? So, in my opinion, and I think some of this is backed up by the fact that they had a recent opportunity to remix and remaster And Justice for All, and they chose not to remix it, they only remastered it. They seem to hold on to this thing of, oh, you know, but it was a statement in time and it should be kept the way it was. Bullshit. It doesn't have bass, and it sounds worse for it. At the time, you could have gotten away with it, and here's why I say that. Metal records back then were mixed more wet, right? So what do I mean by that? More reverb, more delay, more atmosphere, right? Drums being recorded in the room, and room mics being used to capture the ambience of the drums. when you have more reverb, like you can hear in this room, apologies for the echo, but this is just the only place I've got to record at the moment. When you've got that, it's harder to mix with clarity. So you want that biting, cutting, clear, punch you in the nuts kind of guitar sound. It ain't gonna happen if you've got all this wish-washy reverb. And the same is true of having punchy bass drums and a real snappy snare. That stuff comes at a price. You know, you've only got so much space to use in the mix. Here's what I think happened. Lars wanted punchy drums, like he heard on more commercial records, you might say. Yeah, maybe slightly more commercial rock records. Could have been guys who were on the fringe of rock and metal. Yeah, not quite in the extreme, but not quite in the mainstream either. But they probably had bigger budgets and were working with producers that were getting great sonic results. And you know, so he wanted those punchy drums, he wanted that bigger, weightier sound, and I think Hetfield wanted that wall of sound, that wall of thick guitar crunch, and again with the punchy drums. And so how to set about doing that? If you don't know what you're doing, then what you end up doing is turning the guitars up really loud, turning the drums up really loud, and your speakers start to fart, right? They start to sound like they're about to tear themselves apart. So something has to give, and I think that was the bass. Yeah, and I think when they did that and they used it as a bit of a prank, and I'm not saying Rasmussen's lying, I'm saying I think it's fundamentally inexperienced knobheads at the desk mixing, i.e. Hetfield and Ulrich, rather than Rasmussen and an engineer, and sort of disagreeing over direction, perhaps with Rasmussen, I'm not sure, that's speculative, but certainly sounds like a bit of a departure from the previous two records, which were very ambient. And Justice for All is very dry. Everything is about the punch and the cut of the guitars, the sort of crunch and the punch of the drums, right? It's all about that. Sure, could they have been hazing Jason at the same time as they were doing that? Yeah, absolutely. And when he didn't push back, well, then they felt like they could take it to as far of an extreme as they wanted to get those dynamics that they thought they wanted to hear. And to say that there's no bass on Injustice for All is not strictly true. There are some sub-frequencies in there, but they're coming from all the wrong places. They're coming a lot from the low end of the guitar, and that's why it sounds weak. Even if you had a little of the mid-range from the bass, that album would sound dramatically better. It doesn't need to sound like Primus. I've actually done an alternate mix of it. It's not the best, but it's a hell of a lot better than in the release. And Jason plays great on it. That's one thing I really agree with Flemming Rasmussen, is that Jason plays great on it, and it's a real shame. They should have, ultimately, this comes down to Hetfield and Ulrich as a team and their egos and whether they're willing to admit that they're wrong. And I think that's what my issue is with the video, is that everything is kind of pinned just on Lars, and everyone is happy never to lay any sort of blame really at Hetfield's door. Just let Lars take all the shots. But I don't think so. I don't think that's right. I think that it's a collaborative partnership between those two. It always has been, it always will be, to varying degrees as they've tried to power share over the years. Maybe they attempted to power share a bit with Dave in the early days, and that backfired, and then they got trust issues. I don't know. But they did a lot less of it with Kirk for, a lot less of it with Jason. They were prepared to share a bit of writing and all of that kind of stuff with Kirk. And certainly with Cliff, it seemed to be while they had Cliff and Kirk in the band that there was a collaborative spirit, and then, after Cliff passed, then things changed. But there's still that central partnership between the two of them. And that just seems to be the way of things. So the last thing that I think they covered was then the creative directions in the 90s. And they really blamed, what did they say, that, you know, the haircuts and dressing in drag. I gotta be honest, I don't recall them ever really dressing out and out in drag. They had some strange fashion choices, right? But maybe something more like you might see from the alternative kind of neck of the woods. It's like outfits and wardrobe in music videos that you might see in a Smashing Pumpkins video or something like that. Again, there's this insinuation that Lars really drove that. But I don't think that's what happened. I don't think that's what happened. I think this is a Hetfield and Lars thing. And then I think that there's an attempt, and I remember reading a lot of articles like in Guitar World and Guitar Player magazine and stuff like that, when those records were coming out and they were being interviewed, a lot of it, they were being put under a lot of pressure by the press, which the band would have taken as being like the fan base, right? They think that when they hear from the press, they're hearing from the fans. It's not like today where you get to hear directly from the fans. You know, you've got a direct connection. Back then, no internet. You know, you spoke to fans of the shows, yeah, sure, but a lot of stuff that you'd hear would, you know, it would be like an impression you got because the press would be asking certain questions. And the press were just looking for drama. But basically the press, I remember, would always harangue them about were they, did they have like a stranglehold on the band, and were they going to let the other guys write more and all this kind of stuff, and like why did Hetfield track the rhythm guitars and Kirk only did the solos, stuff like that. So when they got to do Load and Reload, they purposely set out to have Kirk more involved in the studio, come in, do rhythm tracks, not just do lead work. And there was a little bit of that vice versa, because it was sort of like, well, okay, well, maybe Hetfield can take a couple of leads. And so he did, you know, famously did it on Nothing Else Matters for the first time. And then he did it with Outlawed Torn. And, you know, they tried things, they experimented with things. And I think ultimately what they're trying to do is kind of look after some of the relationships in the band. And I believe that, you know, they try to involve Jason in that as well. The thing is, I think some of Jason's creative output was not just, from what I recall at the time, it just wasn't the kind of stuff that was relevant to the band. Some of it was, but not a lot of it. You know, he'd come up with some, you know, the odd thing that would be like, oh, that's golden. But then he'd come up with a lot of other stuff where I don't think it was like, oh man, that's crap. It's like, oh, we don't really have a place for that. You know? But yeah, I don't think, I just don't see it as being Hetfield getting walked over by Ulrich and Ulrich bossing the whole band around, you know, this little Danish guy. He's formidable, but I don't think he's that formidable. Anyway, look, that's my take on this. I've rambled on enough now and wasted your time. But I just thought they were getting a little bit clickbaity and like making a narrative, blowing some stuff out of proportion to make their narrative stick, because Lars is a dramatic figure and you can get a lot of clicks off him. They also talked about the Napster thing, but I think that's a complete non-start, right? Because, and they never talk about what's happened since then with Napster. But, you know, the fact is, Lars was absolutely right about Napster. If you've got musician friends, ask them how many streams they get, and ask them how much they got paid for it. You know, if they're lucky, they've got touring set up and they've got merchandise, or maybe they've got a successful YouTube channel. But as far as like, do you get paid for the music you wrote directly? Not very much, I don't think. You know, so Lars was right in a lot of ways, that, you know, perhaps people should have stopped and listened and taken notice of that. So I don't really agree with that the whole thing that like, oh, he brought all this negative publicity to the band because he went with the Napster lawsuit. I think that was a load of horse shit. And I think even Dave Grohl probably would look back, there's a clip of him in the video, saying, oh, you know, I'm not going to take advice from some millionaire that's expecting his next big paycheck or whatever, and is just ticked off that he lost some money. I think Dave Grohl will probably look back at that and go, yeah, actually, that what I said, it didn't age particularly well, you know, as well as the Foo Fighters do these days. But anyway, that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments. I think those two have made their fair share of mistakes, and they continue to make their fair share of mistakes. Like I said, when they remastered And Justice for All, they had an opportunity to fix it, and they didn't. They have the money and the opportunity to fix Saint Anger, and they haven't. And I think there's a stubbornness of refusal to admit when they've been wrong. And I think that's where the cookie crumbles and where the blame lays. Like, if you've ever heard the Some Kind of Monster remix just of the song, it gives you a glimpse of what that album could have sounded like had it just been properly mixed. Like, we're talking EQ, compression, gating, stuff like that. That's it, just like tidying it up and using the best takes. And that record could have sounded a million times better from what we got. But yeah, they didn't, because they don't want to admit that they did the wrong thing, completely the wrong thing. You know? I think that's what it comes down to. Those two acting together, they made decisions together. I think it's the case with Jason. I think it's the case with Dave, although I don't think they made a mistake firing Dave at the time, but I think they made a mistake with how they treated Dave over subsequent years, sure. But they acted in those things together, you know, and then particularly with Jason. Jason, I think, and the way they handled him, and Justice for All is their greatest blunder. But yeah. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to take a couple of weeks off for holiday, and I'll see you when I get back. Take it easy. Bye-bye.